we go. And I just clicked got it. So we've done them all, everyone, and I think people are still jumping on. So let's have to pick it up from wherever we get to. So we've gone through all of the systems, 6 major body systems. I gotta say, guys, I'm really happy with how it went. I'm impressed by what we've been able to take from these things and increase not only our knowledge bases, but our ability to connect with whomever we're speaking to from a clinical perspective that is a specialist. And I hope by this point, and we'll reinforce it next month, you see that this human body thing is really the connection point between all these different systems, and that, well, what do you take from it? One affects all. And because we're GI health specialists, all of those systems converge in the gut. In addition to the fact that when the gut's not working properly, all those systems are affected negatively. But the important point to note is that when the GI system is working well, the likelihood of having spontaneous issues within the rest of those body systems become lesser, because the body is able to communicate and maintain itself as a whole, as it was totally intended to. So rather than go through all the different facts of the endocrine system, because that's just a presentation in and of itself, I think it's important to understand that endocrine system makes up a big part of what represent hormones, but it's not the entire system of the hormones, because we have the paracrine system, the exocrine system. Vitamin D technically is a hormone. It's not a vitamin. That's made spontaneously in the cholesterol of the skin. So we have to understand, when we're talking about the endocrine system, it's a system where organs are ducting their products, their hormones that are synthesized in the specialized tissues directly into the bloodstream. And this hormone feedback system is really what we're trying to maintain. And we'll get into the different kinds of hormones. When it comes to the human body, most of this is regulated by our brain. And I have this little metaphor that I use when I teach about hormones. It's an easy way to kind of understand it. But in the brain, the hypothalamus is the thing that regulates it. I call it the international train station. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Europe and seen one of those giant train stations where there's like 18 tracks converging in one station. That all needs to be coordinated. And there are other things that are required to coordinate hormones. So I hope the background we dive into today, looking at systemic hormones, gives you a greater understanding when you talk to a hormone specialist of what they're trying to do. And this example right here is, if we're stressed out, the end product is our adrenal glands making cortisol. I think everyone here knows that. But the background of what happens for that to take place in a fraction of a second is incredibly intricate and coordinated. You have this perception of stress, which allows the brain to go, oh shit, I need to do something about this. So you have this product called corticotropin releasing hormone or factor, which then tells your pituitary gland, hey, something's going to happen. We need to be prepared. And that creates something called adrenocorticotropin hormone or releasing factor. That's the, what color is that? It's like a teal bubble. So you can see there's a plus there, which creates the plus in the second one. Then the adrenal glands go, oh, this is that stress thing that we have to do again. So they pump out this thing called cortisol. And when cortisol is made, the feedback system closes, the loop closes entirely. So when someone says the word, it's a negative feedback loop. You're stressed, the goal is to make cortisol. Once you've made cortisol and the stress goes away, the loop closes. So that's really the fundamental pattern of how hormones are being synthesized and why. It's like there's a need. They're the most powerful chemical messengers in the body. So they're created based upon need and feedback. And when an adequate amount has been made and received by the body, then the process stops until it starts again. So it goes organ, gland, then hormone. And these are the main organs that are also glands of the body that make all the different hormones. And they really are characteristic based upon what it is we need. And they are, for the most part, maintained as total parallels in both men and women. The biggest difference is men's ovaries can't make estrogen. And if anyone catches what I said, our ovaries are in fact inverted and hanging upside down, and they make mostly testosterone. The major difference is testosterone in men is much higher, obviously, because that's the male sex characteristic. Women and men both have female and male hormones, whereas in a male, the testosterone converts to estrogen in the body, depending on why that is happening. It is an art in and of itself to figure out. And for women, estrogen is made primarily in the ovaries. Testosterone is made in the adrenal glands. So the network here is so important. I got the fortunate benefit of studying with one of the experts in interventional endocrinology. And he'd always tell me, Roland, there's an axis, there's a yin and a yang, which I kind of come back to as a model of hormones that build you up. And that's testosterone, insulin, growth hormone, and I'm missing one more, and estrogen. Those are the building hormones. Then there's the breakdown hormones of progesterone, melatonin, thyroid hormone, and cortisol. And the body's always trying to manage these back and forths in a concept of balance. So if there's too much growth, they throw off the balance of hormones that are being produced and broken down. If there's too much breakdown, the body will try to slow down things of further breakdown. So if you look at the concept of, hyperthyroidism or excessive cortisol, when people get adrenally fatigued, which is not even a great term, but that's the common conception, after a while, the adrenal glands stop outputting cortisol, because cortisol's main job is to actually induce the breakdown of energy that's stored in the body to increase energy levels in the blood so you can continue to fight and persevere. If that is just chronically being driven by external stresses, then after a while, the gland and the organ gets fatigued and the cortisol secretion is insufficient. So then you have someone who has cortisol insufficiency and they're walking around in a fog all the time, which is going to impact their thyroid, which is going to impact their estrogen levels and their insulin response. So it's incredibly nuanced. And when we're talking about systemic hormones, this is what people are trying to do when it comes to hormonal balancing. What we do as a company is nothing tied to hormones in terms of its creation. The only thing natural health supplements can do from an endocrine perspective are help manage the breakdown of hormones. So an example would be estrogen metabolism in the liver. And ultimately, when we have a bowel movement, we poop out the detoxified estrogen, or the increased sensitivity to a hormone. An example is if someone's insulin resistant and type 2 diabetic, and they have severe dysbiosis because they're inflamed, then that insulin signal doesn't work so well. So what we can do is reduce the dysbiosis, enhance the digestive function, and reduce systemic inflammation so that insulin can work more effectively. And I hope that concept makes sense. We can talk about that a little bit more if we have time at the end. But the concept of hormones is entirely regulated by our relationship with our environment. It's all governed by this thing called the circadian rhythm. So your body knows what time of day it needs to release what kind of hormone to direct your physiology. If you remember, I said last lecture, the nervous system is the body communicating with itself. That's the fast system. The endocrine system is the body communicating with itself as the slow system. That's how I look at it. Because hormones are chemical messengers, but they take a long time to be made, get sent around in the body and received, whereas a message going down a nerve can just go instantaneous. It's like flicking on a light switch. But how we regulate our bodies and our physiology in relation to the day determines when we actually make the most effective amount of our hormones. Most of them are released upon waking up in the morning around 6 a.m. So think about that. If you have a poor sleep pattern, if you have an irregular sleep pattern, your body gets out of rhythm in terms of knowing how many hormones to make and when to release them. Or if you're eating really late at night, knowing insulin levels peak in the late evening, and you're sitting in front of Netflix at 11 p.m. crushing potato chips, your body's not going to be able to turn that carbohydrate into energy or storage very effectively. So the likelihood is you're going to gain a lot more weight. So this is back to that example that I like to use. The body needs to know how to control this. And this is an incredible feat of engineering and also planning. Is how do you know which train needs to go on what track? It's all predetermined and pre-planned. There has to be somewhat of a regulation system. Body is the same way. So the most important thing when it comes to working with practitioners who are hormone or endocrinologists or hormone specialists is you have to know what it is they're trying to do with their client. Are they trying to just give them artificial hormones and then hopefully keep them there? Because if you pull all the hormones out that you give someone and they go back to being in a state of like disharmony and discomfort, then you haven't addressed the underlying problem. If we carry that example to this, none of the switches in these tracks would work. So you would have a horrific crash and likely have a lot of people injured or not survive. That's what happens over time in the human body. When there's that lack of regulation, that lack of rhythm is what throws us off. And each hormone has its own rhythm and has its own balance. Just the most important to understand are the sex hormones. So every 28 days, for example, a woman's fluctuation between estrogen and progesterone, luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone, these are very, very tightly regulated. And a lot of women who have used things like birth control pills in the past in their youth disrupt or dysregulate their cycle with this. So when they come off the birth control pill, the body is totally out of whack. If you look at the top right corner, that's a diurnal rhythm of testosterone. So, so for men, you have a testosterone surge in the morning and you have a testosterone surge in the evening. And that does correlate with energy levels. It correlates with when our bodies are most optimally suited for intense activity. And it's also suited when our bodies are most appropriately timed for rest and recovery, because testosterone has a very important maintenance for muscle mass and growth of tissues in both men and women. And the bottom one is kind of interesting. It shows a yearly fluctuation for testosterone and melatonin, which are very closely tied together. So if you look at the summer months, melatonin and testosterone both dip because of likely the longer light cycles, which is when we're more active and we're breaking things down by being outside and in touch with nature. Towards the end of the year, both of them rise because of the shorter light cycles when our bodies would go into a natural rest and recovery mode. So these are really important concepts when it comes to understanding why hormone balancing is so important and why hormones are so powerful. Because if you mess around with hormones as an endocrinologist, you can really hurt someone. So the hormone story is pretty simple as we describe it up until now, and we're keeping it at that level. The body needs to communicate with itself somehow. Hormone is synthesized in a specialized tissue, so it could be estrogen in an ovary, it could be insulin in the beta cells of the pancreas. That hormone is ducted out into the bloodstream and it's transported to the site of action, so it actually gets across the cell membrane and it binds to a very specific protein or a hormone receptor, gets carried to the nucleus of the cell, and then it influences our genetics. So it will influence building new proteins, or it will influence changing some kind of characteristic. So if a man becomes estrogenic, his testosterone is too low and his estrogen goes up too high, his physical characteristics can actually start taking on that of a more feminine signature. A man can develop breasts. His body shape can change, where he's more pear-shaped. His voice can go up. He can start growing less thickly dense hair. So it's really important to understand that our body is trying to signal and regulate all these scenarios. And the reason why so many people are not well is because their hormones are so out of whack. So the body is just trying to talk, 7 different languages without understanding each other. If I spoke to you in Japanese and you responded in, Greek, that might be a problem. So when it comes to the overarching understanding of the 2 classifications of hormones, we have 2 main ones. We have steroid hormones, which are fat-based hormones, which we'll talk more about. And we have peptide hormones, which are proteins. So the interesting parallel is peptide hormones and enzymes are fundamentally very similar. They have a lot of similar characteristics in how they work in the body. Most practitioners you all work with are likely going to focus on steroid hormones, which get subcategorized into corticoids. So you get the female sex hormones and the male sex hormones, and cortisol is tied into this as well. I find this stuff really incredible because it also clears up a lot of things that are kind of vilified in the health industry. Without cholesterol, you have no hormones. So an important consideration is if you work with docs who are putting a lot of clients on statins, or if these doctors are very nuanced in their maintenance of understanding that cholesterol is evil, then I must keep cholesterol low. Well, if you keep cholesterol low in an old man, he can have the testosterone level of a prepubescent female. And this is an important concept because testosterone actually is correlated with health span and lifespan in men, and all-cause mortality is very much closely tied to low testosterone levels, high body composition levels, and chronic inflammation. So we need to know first and foremost, if someone's talking about cholesterol and they're saying cholesterol is evil, it's really kind of a half-truth. So how cholesterol gets transported around the body is in these little things called cholesterol molecules. We have HDL, we have LDLs, and when someone says bad cholesterol and they reference an LDL, that is a misnomer. There's no such thing as a bad cholesterol. LDL is a particle, it carries cholesterol, and HDL is not good cholesterol. HDL is a particle that just carries cholesterol back to your liver or helps deliver it to tissues. So we need to understand that in some cases, when the body bumps up cholesterol levels, it might be because it's trying to make a lot more hormones. So if you go to the doctor and you run a blood panel and they look at your hormones, say, oh, your hormones are low. Oh, well, your cholesterol is high. We got to lower that. There's more to that story than a lot of people understand. And I think it's just really important that all of you here understand that the body is not doing anything by accident. We've talked about this since January. And the concept of making adequate hormones all starts with cholesterol. And I used to have to know this pathway by heart when I was mentoring with an endocrinologist. I know the general gist of it, but if you understand this, with lack of cholesterol, all these pathways slow down. All of your pregnenolone, which creates your DHEA, which is like the lifeblood of your cells, your progesterone, which eventually can convert to estrogen, your testosterone, your aldosterones, all of these things have to be maintained in a very important network and balance. And a good endocrinologist will understand this, and they will go, okay, I have to balance all the hormones in the network properly to help my client get better, because if you balance and restore hormones to optimum levels, that person will feel instantaneously better, and their physiology will respond instantaneously as well, within reason, within a couple days to weeks, because hormones are such a powerful signal. If you compare the strength of a hormone to an enzyme, a hormone is going to have a million times more powerful biological effect than an enzyme because it changes things right away. But the real important thing to understand is if that client is in a mess with their hormones because their health is a mess, you can balance that person's hormones, but unless you address their gut health, unless you address their microbiome, their dysbiosis, unless you address systemic inflammation, unless you address the specific area of their body that may be struggling, when you remove the artificial hormone, everything will likely go back to its original state. And I do believe a massive difference between someone who's healthy, ages well, and an individual whose hormones are always a mess, even to the point where there's a manifestation of autoimmunity, is all those peripheral body systems are so weak and dysfunctional. How could you possibly ask the body to regulate any kind of hormone because the body's in a state of constant stress? Peptide hormones are a little bit different. So the sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen are slower acting, and they're very powerful. This is why if someone's into bodybuilding, if a female bodybuilder takes male hormones to increase her muscle mass, there's physical characteristic changes that happen. Her jaw gets bigger, her body will start to grow more hair, her voice will get deeper. That's permanent. Peptide hormones are a little bit less permanent, but they're just as powerful. They act a lot quicker. So if someone's a type 1 diabetic and they eat carbohydrates and they don't make insulin, it doesn't matter how much food they eat, those nutrients are not going to get in the cells. So it's the same problem with type 2 diabetics when they get very old, is they can eat as much food as they want, their blood sugar rises to a ridiculous amount, and there's no insulin that's able to be made because their pancreas is so fatigued to drive that nutrition back into the cell. So someone who's a type 2 diabetic, in my mind, would always benefit from a digestive enzyme support, because they need every ounce of help they can get while you start to reverse engineer what caused the type 2 diabetes in the first place. Same thing with growth hormone or thyroid hormone or melatonin. These are factors of lifestyle for the most part, and they're correlated to high loads of inflammation. So if someone doesn't sleep well, if they're incredibly stressed, if they're looking at bright lights in the evening, growth hormone and melatonin will both be low. Growth hormone rebuilds tissue. So if someone ages well, if someone always feels rested and recovered, they likely have decent growth hormone levels. Melatonin helps to break down inflammatory proteins in the brain and the nervous system. So if you're looking at bright lights in the evening, your eyes are getting the message that it's the middle of the day. This is how circadian rhythm works. So that's why the Hedron glasses are such an easy sell for everyone, because how much effort does it really take once the sun goes down to put on a red lens in your face and start looking at the world with an orange tint? Thyroid hormone's a little bit more nuanced. That's mostly regulating metabolic rate, how much energy your body can produce, how fast tissues break down, and oftentimes people think thyroid and autoimmunity. It's a very, very closely tied connection to gut health, dysbiosis, and it seems to affect women a lot more. So the body is slowing down the creation of thyroid hormone to preserve itself because there's too much systemic inflammation going on. If anyone wants to dive a little bit deeper, I'll let you guys go through this, but this shows you the major hormones, the major areas they're being produced in the body, and the major effects and possibly relationships that they have with each other. And if you want to focus on clients who are endocrinologists, this is a really good starting point. So this is the second part of the lecture. I want to establish that the first part is looking at the major endocrine system. That's the systemic ability for the body to create and release and receive the message of hormones that affects the gut-brain axis, which is inclusive of the enteroendocrine system and the gut endocrine system, because the GI system has its own set of hormones that only exist within the gut. And if you remember from last lecture, we talked about the enteric nervous system, which is the, 80 billion bundle of neurons in the gut. And there are specialized cells called enteroendocrine cells that make hormones that regulate the digestive process. Here's an example. And if someone wants to answer the question, I would love that. If you eat avocado, how does your body know to make bile to help digest the fat in it? How does that process happen? Does anyone know? It's for 5,000 bonus points, guys. Come on.
Is it through the vagus nerve?
It's part of it, yes. So the vagus nerve is what eventually signals your gallbladder to release bile, but there's a very important hormone called cholecystokinin that when your body eats, to a point, protein, but mostly fat, the sensing of that fat triggers the release of a hormone that communicates to your nervous system that it needs to tell your brain and your vagus nerve that it needs to make bile. How cool is that? It's incredible. So we have our own endocrine system entirely in the gut that regulates not only the body's ability to communicate with itself, like we spoke about last time, the gut-brain axis via the vagus nerve and the enteric nervous system, but those hormones being secreted in response to what's going on in your digestive system regulates the process. So the enteroendocrine cells, they're their own hormone-producing cells, and they're kind of like, strategically placed along the entire digestive tract. They're very specific in the stomach, then they're different in the small intestine, they're different in the large intestine. They're called like M cells and L cells. And what they basically do is they help to work with the nerves to manage communication within the gut. So if your stomach needs to break down protein, well, the hormone gastrin is really important for stimulating that process of hydrochloric acid release. If that food is now moving through your small intestine, it needs to be regulated in its speed so it doesn't go too quickly so you don't absorb the food properly. If it's reached the end of your colon and that contraction is telling you, oh, nature's calling, something has to regulate that. And it doesn't just happen, it happens autonomously, but it doesn't happen without strategic coordination. So the enteroendocrine cells have an incredibly important job. And as you can see here, it regulates even satiety signals. And the difference between someone who's able to understand once they've had enough food and when someone can continue to eat because there's no satisfying their appetite, that is a poor communication pathway within the gut-brain axis via the hormones. And the other thing is these enteroendocrine cells crosstalk with your microbes. So your gut bacteria communicate with the cells of your GI system in a methodology of what's called crosstalk. And this crosstalk is all by chemical compounds. So if your enteroendocrine cells release serotonin, your gut microbiome is going to change. If your gut microbiome releases short chain fatty acids, that's going to influence the amount of serotonin theoretically that your endocrine cells produce. So there's this chronic communication feedback system within the body. And in my world, health is when communication is effortless and efficient. Disease is when two people are talking, both with their fingers in their ears, and no one's trying to listen. So the body's always trying to find its way to find, regulation of homeostasis. So this is a really, complicated slide. It's the best one I could find, but this is how these endocrine cells work. They have all of these inputs. So it could be carbohydrates, all the macronutrients. It could be something from your gut microbes, which create short chain fatty acids. And there are also these things we've not talked about much called secondary bile acids. When these compounds interact with a receptor on an enteroendocrine cell, if you look at the bottom, you can see where it says blood vessel. The gut-brain axis communicates through two ways, the vagus nerve and the circulatory system. So these enteroendocrine cells release hormones that get directly into the bloodstream, or if you look on the right-hand side with that other arrow, it says connection to nervous system. They can influence directly via signaling the enteric nerves, which will go all the way up that chain of what Larry just mentioned to start to communicate back with the vagus nerve, because it goes from the brain to the gut and the gut back up to the brain. And these are all the important hormones of the enteroendocrine system. So these are very much regulated specifically within the gut, and they help direct the organs of digestion to do their job. They help signal the hunger response. So whenever you get that gurgly stomach and all of a sudden you have that hunger pang, you're like, oh man, I want to eat something. It's not by accident. It's your body telling your GI system to tell you you're hungry, so you go do that. You know, things like serotonin and other neurotransmitters like dopamine, GABA, they're made via the enteroendocrine cells, substance P and different neuropeptides to stimulate protein digestion and satiety. So all of these things are incredibly important, especially when someone has dysbiosis, because if the gut microbes, as you can see on that second paragraph, are producing the wrong kinds of short chain fatty acids, or if they're not producing what are called secondary bile acids, or something that we all know, if there's too many lipopolysaccharides that are getting into the gut and they're modulating these cells, then it's going to cause faulty hormone signaling, which can theoretically lead to something like leaky gut because there's too much inflammation as a result of the dysbiosis. So putting these two things together is really important to understand. The major endocrine organs, which we spoke about in the first part of this lecture, they have an effect on the entire body. So the testosterone that gets produced in the testicles of men or the adrenal glands of women will have a systemic response, but they also will affect the gut. Every major hormone in the body will affect some aspect of the GI system in its ability to maintain function. The local endocrine organs, or the local endocrine hormones, the ones that I just had up there, regulate local gut function and the microbiome in and of itself. So it's in a more isolated manner. If you affect the major hormones, then the local hormones will follow. So an example would be if someone has growth hormone issues, growth hormone affects the ability for the body to replicate and repair. So if someone has, it's a question for someone on the call here, if they're feeling brave, if someone has low growth hormone, what could that mean for leaky gut and its ability to heal?
There's no repair mechanism.
Boom.
Because it's a catabolic state versus an anabolic state.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Absolutely. So if everyone just heard that and they understood, without growth hormone, we have a hard time building new cells. Cells regulate the speed of how they divide. So if someone has leaky gut, those cells are being made off of weak cells. So those gaps are never going to form and replicate, or regulate rather, until our body's ability to build healthy cells come back. And if we have systemically low growth hormone from poor sleep quality, disrupted circadian rhythm, poor dietary practices, lack of exercise, if someone's trying to heal their leaky gut and they're putting in glutamine and all these funky things that people use as gut healing, and they haven't thought about the fact that one of the best ways to heal leaky gut is regulate your sleep patterns, well, they're missing a big picture of how the body operates. And then that's going to affect the local hormones. So if someone's got somewhat of a resistance to, regulating satiety, for example, or the example I use with if we, eat fat and our body produce hormone that tells the gallbladder to contract. If we have a weak gallbladder, if we have gallbladder stones or cholestasis, it doesn't matter how much of that hormone we release, the gallbladder isn't going to function properly. So they're going to likely build up issues with SIBO, maldigestion of fats, constipation, stuff of that nature. So the integration of these two things is if the major hormones are off, the local hormones will be off. They will compensate for a while, just like the major ones will, but ultimately the body will become entirely out of balance. And I think this is pretty cool here. So we just talked about the growth hormone deficiencies in leaky gut. Another one is cortisol. Anyone here been a cortisol junkie in their life before? Because everyone's hand should go up. What does cortisol do? Cortisol modulates the entire profile of what your gut bacteria look like. So cortisol will change the landscape of gut diversity. It will allow certain species to overgrow. It may suppress the growth of other healthy species. So the more cortisol someone pumps out, the more their microbes change and the more their enteroendocrine cells change. Another one is estrogen and dysbiosis. Estrogen metabolization is incredibly important. It happens primarily in the liver and it's finished by your gut microbes. And when you have a bowel movement, estrogen and other detoxified hormones leave your body. Think of how many people struggle, especially women, with chronic constipation. There's even a field of study called the estrobolome, which means that certain microbes can break down estrogens that are in the stool and allow them to get back in the bloodstream so they're reabsorbed. And we know that, you know, chronically high estrogens and cancers have a very, very high correlative relationship. Another one is thyroid hormone and constipation. How many people are hypothyroid out there and they're getting pumped full of Synthroid or Cytomel or Armour desiccated thyroid? That might help short term, but the reason your body's slowing everything down is likely you're very inflamed. And the lower your thyroid hormone reception, the less likely you are to have regular bowel habits because it slows down your metabolic rate, which slows down bowel evacuation. Insulin's another one. If you have high insulin, that changes your microbiome to what's called an obesogenic pattern, but you can also increase or improve insulin sensitivity with butyrate producing bacteria in your gut. And that has nothing to do with your pancreas, but it's a systemic connection or communication point that I find very fascinating. And testosterone and gut inflammation in men is very closely tied. The more toxic someone's gut, the more body fat they have concentrated around the midsection, the higher the amount of cortisol their body's putting out because they're inflamed, the lower their testosterone levels are. Testosterone really does help regulate some action or activity of white blood cells when it comes to inflammation in the immune system. So if testosterone is too low, inflammation can run rampant, partially because of the inability of testosterone to regulate the immune system. So the most important perspective with this whole thing is this last part. If the main hormones of the endocrine system are stuck in poor signaling along with the nervous system, because it comes part and parcel, then the gastric hormones are not going to properly synthesize or be received. And this is a really cool graphic that shows everything. The most common reason that the gut-brain axis gets disrupted is because of chronic stress. And the body's response to chronic stress is the same every time. It changes the nervous system. So the enteric neurons and the different immune cells and the enteroendocrine cells and the complexes all get rerouted from a position of being healthy and in regulation and homeostasis to it's got to figure out how to deal with the stress. So the HPA axis making cortisol chronically above the levels that humans were ever meant to experience is going to be driving this process. And you can look at all the different perturbations there, all kinds of stress, even from a child can be patterned in your nervous system, microbial signals. So if you have dysbiosis, as I mentioned, and then the influence of things like probiotics and diet and various other aspects are all going to affect bowel habits, which will affect digestive health as a whole. So Ralph, I know you were asking me this question, man. I told you to wait till the lecture, but I guess you had to find your way to get in there before everyone else got a chance. So why do people not talk about this whole thing when it comes to hormones having a powerful effect on the gut? Because it's not necessarily commonplace to think about this as a logical way to look at the human body. But I don't know if this is subtle enough or if you guys want bigger font next time. Anyone here who has a client who is an endocrinologist, who is someone who specializes in the management of hormones naturally, if they're not thinking about the GI system when they're trying to restore someone's health, they're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. Because unless you clean up the dysbiosis, unless you help to push the body in the direction of healing the leaky gut, notice how I didn't say fix a leaky gut, there's multiple aspects of that. Unless you're digesting your food properly, unless you're breaking down your proteins to make peptide hormones, they're pissing into the wind with an umbrella in front of them. Sure, you'll block some of the water hitting you back. Well, it's not really water now, is it? But they're not going to fully, shield themselves because they don't even need the umbrella when you do this whole thing right. Because the main axis of how the whole body is integrating with itself is very, very tightly regulated and very interconnected. Most people who have issues with the endocrine system go down the right-hand side of this graphic. So it is an adrenal gland problem. It's not an adrenal gland problem. It's an adrenal response to a very, very poor out-of-sync lifestyle, which creates a nervous compensation, which creates the immune system to get involved, which drives inflammation. It's kind of the same story that's been told over and over again since the very first lecture of this series, which is the energy metabolism thing, because over time, when your hormones are compromised or your nervous system is compromised, your energy metabolism will eventually become compromised too. And when there is no energy, there is no vital life force. There's no essence of vitality. So whatever the person as the practitioner is trying to do, the bigger picture is they're trying to get that person healthy. And they have to figure out all the different patterns of what's going wrong to understand where things fit in. And I do think it's a huge opportunity for endocrinologists to be more well-versed in the digestive system, not only because of the entire endocrine system, but understanding the impact that the gut has in every aspect of the human body. And this is a big connection point. If the body's unhealthy, it can't communicate with itself. Lack of communication forces that compensation, which is, compensation is good if you roll an ankle and you have to limp for a while. But if that ankle never, releases itself of its limp, that's going to cause some structural changes over time. And it alters that ideal set point because of overused resources. What this means is if you start overproducing hormones and you need things like fatty acids, cholesterol, and amino acids and proteins to make those hormones, if you're deficient, there's not going to be enough to go around after a while. So the deficiencies prevent the body from healing and returning to its ideal operating system. As Carol mentioned, with a catabolic state and growth hormone, if you lack essential amino acids in your diet, you can't balance out growth hormone levels naturally by adopting all the right things until you fix your digestion. So this basically means the body gets stuck in that illness cycle and degeneration begins. Everything we see nowadays of chronic degeneration is preventable and it is reversible to some degree, but it happens usually beginning in the 4th decade of life to show itself. And then however many decades people get after the fact is just when that disease pattern has enough time to take stranglehold. And the common thing is all of these conditions do have root in poor gut function because the gut is the window into everything. So I won't go through all of these just in the interest of time, but you can see that, factors that affect hormone output, there's an incredible amount of them. And some of them are just free advice that you can give to people. Like I'm teaching them about light exposure and why hedron glasses are really good for when the sun goes down. Or just talking about, the benefits of touching your feet to the earth if you're getting an overexposure to EMFs from sitting in front of a computer. If someone's on an extremely high carbohydrate diet, for example, if they're on an inappropriate diet for them, that alone over a few months can help balance out your hormones. And then when it comes to factors that affect hormone receptivity, all of these things connect to inflammation. So nutritional deficiencies compromise energy production, blood sugar regulation causes issues with oversecretion of insulin, toxic fats that we consume don't help build healthy cells, stress of all kinds, sleep deprivation, excessive exercise, like marathon runners and ultra endurance athletes, they typically have very, very poor hormone panels. So when we know these things, we can go into a potential conversation with a doc or a practitioner armed with a good background and base of knowledge. Then we can bridge that conversation directly to the GI system and systemic inflammation and start telling them the story about how to consider things outside the purview of what they might be doing already. So with that, I'm calling on Mr. I can't even remember if you're Hutch or Starsky right now. That's how off I went somewhere.
Yeah, I think I'm Mr. Hutch.
All right, you're the blonde one. Let's do this.
Yeah, the blonde one. That's right.
These guys again. All right, so I wanted to give Jason a little bit of time to get into Betazyme, just so you guys can hear the message again, but maybe in a different way from a different person. Knowing that systemic inflammation, immune health, and immune function are so closely tied to regulating the nervous system, regulating the endocrine system. Jason, why don't you start with Betazyme and its approach in not fixing hormones, but talking about immune health and microbiome health.
Yeah, no, for sure. And just to maybe let people know that the feedback I'm getting from docs already in just like a week and a half has been pretty incredible, especially from doctors that do muscle testing, like Dr. Coleman, for example, who he's like, I can't figure out why this stuff just keeps testing out for everyone, regardless of what, kind of issue they have. So I've been hearing that from actually quite a few different people. But again, just to get back to the story of immune modulation and how important it is to have a product that doesn't, fire Th1, doesn't fire Th2, but also just balances the immune system. And then therefore is going to help, the cells upregulate, and healthy cells recreate themselves, and non-healthy cells to go through good old-fashioned apoptosis. And then when I'm approaching this to a doctor, I like to really just tell the story of the Chinese fishermen. Like, these people fish in flats, so they're just, the water's up to their knees. The rest of their bodies look like crap, but their feet up to their knees look amazing because their skin. So they figured out there was a bacteria that secreted pure beta glucan, 100% pure glucan. So I guess this was a topic that came up with a lot of people over the week. So it's 75% beta, 25% alpha. So 100% pure glucan, and the body desperately needs the alpha chain to help with the conversion. So when it comes to gut health, I've never seen anything work as well. This is like a gut healer, but also a immune modulator, which takes a ton of burden off the adrenal glands. So fluid balance is one of the adrenal glands' most important roles, and if without that we would die. So this is another thing that can really help with fluid balance in the colon. Also, I'd like to hear JP talk a little bit about satiety and substance P when we get into some of the probiotics here. But just the ability for this to, if it can do for the outside of the skin what it can do for the inside of the skin, repair it in a healthy way without doing any damage or over repairing the skin like you would if it was like some kind of a synthetic hormone replacement or something like that. Yeah, your skin might look really cool for a short period of time, but your gallbladder is a complete mess, and that's just a depleting return over time. So anything else you want to add there?
No, I think that was beautifully said. When someone's dosing Betazyme, because this is it's a new
Yes,
product.
super important.
Well,
Yep.
Let's touch on that for a moment.
Yeah, very important to don't do any over one capsule. And that's another thing that I've been having doctors ask me is like, oh, well, this seems to test so well. Could I, load dose somebody on them? And again, very important not to do that. There's even a little bit of research, but this was in an animal study that shows if you do go over the 183 milligrams, your benefit can decrease slightly, but then after that you get zero benefit. So you're just wasting your money. And it's also very important to take it 2 hours away from Digeszyme, Digeszyme Plus, and Cleanzyme, because they contain beta glucanase. So it's going to break the beta glucan down more quickly, and you're not going to get the benefit, especially deeper into the bowel and into the bloodstream and into some of the places like a deeper cellular level.
Yeah, I think an important thing to think about, if everyone is trying to run through their minds, well, how do I position this in the connection of hormones? Our environments are not necessarily set up to suit our best interests for health nowadays. So there's more immune system perturbations than there are immune system aids in nature and in life. So this would be something where you could probably get away with using this as a way to keep the immune system healthy, or add it into the process of, dealing with systemic inflammation, immune dysregulation, and dysbiosis. So yes. I think it's something that's really cool that as we get more into it, we'll tease out some more connection points where you can help give different approaches. Yeah.
I've already had 3 or 4 people come back and talk about people that have led long hauling symptoms or post symptoms from, a certain medical approach that are already showing significant improvement. So that's just really, really, really cool to see. And then also, Brad touched on this in our quick training, that the animal industry is desperately trying to find ways to get rid of antibiotics, because they are now, having to basically, swallow the the mess that they've created with overusing antibiotics, and beta glucans are just going to be one of the main things that they're going to use to try to keep animals healthy moving forward. So
Sweet.
okay, so JT, substance P, satiety. Yes, right. Yeah, exactly.
Let's do the intro where it's like you segue that nicely to
Yes.
so antibiotics are a fact also of things that likely do have a negatively on the endocrine system and its regulation. You can alter insulin sensitivity, you can alter the ability for thyroid hormone to effectively bind to some degree, you can change estrogen metabolism. So from a perspective of keeping the gut healthy, we know the Theralac Pro story. You have small and large intestine support, you have the ability to produce pro and anti-inflammatory cytokines. I hope from this lecture and the last one, you've understood now that there are some nuances to making sure that the microbiomes of each section of the bowel and the gut are healthy, because the quantity of microbes in the large intestine is probably much more finely attuned to aiding things like insulin sensitivity and estrogen metabolism, because that's where it's being regulated. But the microbiome in the small intestine is very much more impacted with its ability to communicate with the immune system and the immune cells to regulate digestion. So this is a really cool thing. And I guess, Mr. Thurston, you want to jump in here with substance P or some of these neuroendocrine secretions that are coming from the enteroendocrine cells?
I'm probably not going to get into that too much because, quite honestly, I'm not all that knowledgeable on those particular outputs from these bacteria. But what I will say is that balance is the most important part of the GI tract, the microbial part. You can't have too many organisms that are making glucuronic acid and returning estrogen into the system, so you need to balance them. You can't have too many of any one thing. Everything in balance, including balance. And yeah, I know we get out of whack every once in a
Now
while.
I've gone cross-eyed because I'm trying to be balanced and I'm thinking now, have I overbalanced myself?
Right.
Stay balanced one more time.
Yeah, we just, lactobacillus grows so much slower than so many other organisms that if you want to maintain some balance, you have to put in a lot of numbers. And that's where the alginate comes in handy, and the lactostim come in handy, and having 50 billion guaranteed at expiration come in handy, is that they can then help compete at a different level than, if you just have equal numbers, you're going to get outnumbered very, very, very quickly. So that's why I like Theralac Pro, and I like Trubifidol Pro for just a little more of a calming situation. But there's only two ways out: through your skin and the other end of the straw. So,
Right.
And no one wants giant skin protrusions, boils, and pimples. At least if you do, then you're not
And
part of our.
I will say, JT, maybe a little too hard on yourself, because I've heard you talk probably for a good straight 5 minutes with Carrie Jones, who, those of you guys that know her, she's the chief scientist at Dutch Test, and she was blown away about the connections that you took to more microorganisms to the endocrine system. So that was pretty cool.
yeah, sometimes I just have a tendency to get too complicated, and everybody tries to talk the same way, and it doesn't translate well. It's like me trying to speak, Latin. The only new language I've learned is euphemism. That's the only new language I've learned lately.
Not pig Latin. That was very passe. That was very 90s. Something like substance P, for everyone on the call, it's a secretion by the enteroendocrine cells in response to the consumption of protein that help regulate satiety feedback. So this is how your brain knows not to eat a 24-ounce steak every time you sit down to dinner. There's a certain amount of it that gets secreted when enough protein has been ingested in the system. Same thing with neuropeptides and some of these other things. They regulate satiety and feedback, so your GI system can move from the intake phase of food via hunger signaling to the digestive phase and absorption phase, because you've had enough energy and macronutrients come in, so the body can start to go to the next step of the process. Yep. So,
and we have several products that help regulate satiety, this being one, anything with sun fiber in it, digestive enzymes. So
So the long and short of it is keep balance in the small and large intestine. This is a great way to maintain that for people, even nowadays when you're eating an ideal diet, whatever that means, when you're drinking high quality water and you have a good lifestyle per se. Our microbiomes aren't what they were. And that kind of bridges the gap to something really cool when it comes to microbiome. Jason and I briefly touched on the concept of estrogen metabolism and inflammation and detox. So, before the microbiome has the ability to help finish the job when it comes to hormone detoxification, it is the job of the liver and its phase 1 and phase 2 enzymes to metabolize these hormones so they can be bound to something, so they can be excreted on a regular basis. And the nasty side of excessive estrogen metabolism is inflammatory overload and immune dysregulation. There's a lot of cancer tied to that. So making sure that someone's liver has the strength to do so, to detoxify estrogen, sometimes with a little bit of help from something like sulfurazyme, will finish the process properly when it's time to regulate bowel function and get their bowels moving on a more regular basis again. So Jason, why don't you go into a little bit of the sulfurazyme liver connection?
Yeah, well, especially when it comes to detoxifying hormones for men, prostate cancer is a massive issue, of course, right now. So this is probably one of the best aromatase players that has been researched. People they take it over far over DIM these days, diindomethane. So, and then of course, when it comes to supporting the cell danger response, we know all about Dr. Eric Balcavige's lectures on that. So that's where we get a really nice benefit to the thyroid to stop a lot of the attacking for Hashimoto's. So I think just between those two items, we've just got something absolutely wonderful here to support just overall hormone balance, from just pretty much the entire endocrine system.
Yeah, and talking about something like autoimmune hypothyroidism.
Yes. Yeah,
that
exactly.
will compromise the body's ability to make adequate amounts of T4, which need to be converted to T3. So if T4 is low, conversion is compromised. You can put all the armor, you can put all the cofactors in until you address the inflammation locally in the thyroid, the gland can't come back online. And that really ties into what I was mentioning before with the body needs to be able to regulate and communicate with itself. And sometimes it needs a little bit of assistance to remove the blockage.
Yep. And the liver ultimately conjugates all the hormones. So this is just another wonderful player for hormone conjugation. And, when I've muscle tested people in the past that have issues with the ovaries and we'll do a test, there's almost always a connection to the liver, the same with the prostate or the testicles. So, and when using sulfurazyme, it seems to balance that axis time and time and time again. And the HPA axis, especially if there's an infection in the liver, you might need to use a little further support with like a Cleanzyme or something like that. But between, that little mix, I've seen just wonderful things happen. The hair comes back and all those things that we know are driven from a lot of the issues with hormone dysregulation.
And on the dosing side, 2 capsules a day is probably a great starting point. Any specialized considerations in what you were just speaking about?
As far as dose?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So start with 2. Some people, this is one that you might need to go up to 3, maybe 4 maximum, but then usually go down. All the sulforaphane research at about 3.5 capsules would be like the threshold, kind of like a Betazyme, 183 milligrams. You can go a little bit higher, but usually you don't want to do that for a very long period of time. But it's my personal opinion that adding the Astrozyme, that we get to that threshold faster. Of course, we haven't done a study to prove that, but that's just from what I've heard from doctors over and over and over and over again.
Amazing.
Does
Thank you.
sulfurazyme help with glucuronidation?
Indirectly, probably.
Not directly, but indirectly, yeah.
Indirectly, okay.
Yeah. Glucuronide you can find in a lot of different foods, or calcium D-glucarate is probably the best.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Sun Balance kind of piggybacks last week. We've been doing Sun Balance and theanine again, just because of the parallels between the gut-brain axis and the gut endocrine axis. So we did a big explanation last time, but anything that's going to dysregulate brain inflammation. If you remember at the beginning of this lecture, I said it was very much a brain coordination when it came to the systemic regulation of hormones. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary is really the one that determines what hormone gets released at what time of day in what amount. So systemic brain inflammation will compromise that process. So it will basically, alter those pathways. It will alter the timing or the release of them. Something as simple as, chronic head trauma in sports. A lot of the guys that I've dealt with who have had concussions, they have very, very low testosterone levels. And that's due to the fact that their brain is chronically inflamed. Same thing with growth hormone. And these are pro athletes. So just that little thing alone, rather than, trying to cheat the system and know when their drug test is coming up and artificially increase testosterone levels, because there's a lot of detriments to doing that by itself, working with the entire system of down regulating not only systemic brain inflammation, the sun balance, but getting into theanine, also helping to regulate the nervous system's uppity and down like nature, which Jason, you always do a really good job of the sun theanine being like an adaptogen for the brain.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think there's much more to say about sun balance because Lisa did such a great job going over it, but we have two of the flavonoids that we know are super important for brain inflammation in that player, and they're at the, the correct doses. And they also support the healthy microglial cells, which we all need to take care of desperately because the way the environment is, they're going to be chomped away at quite rapidly if we don't take care of them. Okay, so then to sun theanine, yeah, of course, this is just a beautiful adaptogen for the brainwaves, alpha, delta, beta, theta. Seeing tons of people just love to use this with their brain taps or their neurofeedback devices. They find they get to a better brain map a lot faster when they add this baby in. But one thing I'd like to add for the adrenal connection, a lot of us on this call, we love our coffee, but coffee and cigarettes are about the two things that'll beat up your adrenal glands more than anything. But if you take some of this, and it's the caffeine in the coffee that's causing the damage. And this type of theanine, the micronized L-theanine, is an incredible caffeine antagonist. So you'll still get the benefit, but you won't get the overwiring nervous system. Hence, it won't get down to your adrenal glands most likely and start beating the crap out of them. So if you're a coffee drinker, I think it's really important to take this player to protect your adrenal glands.
And because it is just a single free-form amino acid, very safe and well tolerated, but it also means you don't need to mega dose it because more theanine doesn't equal more relaxation.
No,
there is a blood-brain barrier threshold that 1 to 2 capsules is likely good enough to adhere to.
Yeah, and you can take it in the morning, and it's not going to make you tired. It's just going to help you have a more clean and focused energy rather than a jittery energy if we're taking our coffee or whatever. And then at nighttime, it's going to slow the brain waves down that we want to sleep. So again, the adaptogen for the brain.
The last one we'll touch on here is Chlorazine, which is a product we don't talk about a whole lot, but a product I really like and have had a lot of success with, especially with people who are in that world where hormones matter because they're very active people. They could be gym goers, they could be recreational athletes, but their GI systems are toxic. A lot of people who are in that athletic arena, because of the stresses of exercise, because of the overconsumption of food, specifically proteins affecting their gut bacteria, there's a lot of gut-induced toxicity that basically gets supercharged every time they eat, because believe it or not, eating can be one of the most toxic things you can do to your GI system. So Chlorazine has a really amazing ability to bind up a lot of stuff within the GI system, but what it also does is it can kind of bind environmental stuff that is maybe existing within the body that resides in the gut, biofilms or what have you, which will negatively impact the entire system. Things like heavy metals, which can compromise hormone synthesis, increase or upregulate inflammation. So using Chlorazine as an adjunct to a multitude of things, to a detox program, to a systemic inflammatory program, or just as a nutritional aid, because a lot of the nutrients you get in microscopic levels in chlorella and spirulina aren't really found anywhere else in the world. And they're really good at helping with DNA repair and making sure that the body doesn't start to dysregulate itself. So that's kind of my approach with Chlorazine. Jason, you have anything to add?
Yeah. Well, just the cleanliness of the product, it's 99.9% pre-digested protein. So again, people who have really beat up digestive systems. A lot of times, especially elderly patients, we can't even start them on a digestive enzyme because it's too much. So this is usually where I start with them, so they can actually start absorbing some real nutrients. And it contains a nice panel of living forms of nutrients. So no synthetic Bs, synthetic As, that type of thing. And then somebody remind me, Bethany or Larry, there's a new concern with chlorella and blue-green algae. What's the chemical? Can one of you guys hop on and remind me? I know it's in my notes here somewhere.
It is the blue-green algae, but there's a special form of it, and I forget what.
Oh, was that the Klamath Lake, the E3 Live stuff?
Yes.
Yeah, that stuff's pretty dirty.
Well, there's a certain chemical that Bethany alerted me to, and it's catching a lot of press right now. But anyway, we went and checked, and we've had our product tested for it, every single batch, and it comes back undetectable. So I know JP, we put that in an email somewhere that where Sonia helped us track that down. So we'll make sure to send that out to you, because that will be.
I found the email from Bethany.
Okay.
BMMA.
That's it. Yep. So if people ask about it, this product's tested for it, and it's undetectable. So.
And because of its purity, I would say starting slowly to not induce a mass exodus of your bowels or your client's bowels, because they might not like you so much if you make them, crap themselves as an adult spontaneously. 1 to 2 capsules a day is a good maintenance dose.
Yep.
I could see the reason going up a little higher if you needed to, doing some heavy metal chelation or just making sure that there is nothing that's going to get free once you've liberated metals from storage. But, overall, I would say that that's a pretty good expose when it comes to understanding the interconnection point of products with our topic. And as always, everyone, thank you so much for your time. Jason, thank you for your help. Yes, everyone who jumped on and participated, thank you very much for doing so. And
maybe one quick step back on Chlorozine, because there are 2 ways that I really do like to use this with food for people struggling, with nutrient absorption as just a nice general chelator, but away from food, especially for people that suffer from low energy from EBV. So I've had really good success using it. I usually try it at night, but if it winds them up, then I use it in the morning, but systemically. So keep it away from food like you would a systemic enzyme for at least 30 minutes or so. It seems to give people a really nice boost of energy.
And I would just like to make one comment on dosing. This is the one that I probably would never go over 6 capsules in a day.